Hi, everybody. My name is Elliot Jordan, and I'm here to tell you how not to do bad things with AutoPkg. Hope that's the right session that you meant to be in. I also want to thank not only everybody here for attending, but also PSU for putting on this wonderful conference year after year, and WPSU for filming. They really do a great job, and I'm very appreciative to be part of it. So I've met many of you probably in person, and maybe you've even seen me give something like this talk before. But if I haven't met you, please introduce yourself to me afterwards or say hi in Slack. Especially if you don't agree with some of the things I'm saying. Definitely I want to hear some differing opinions. But even if you do, it'd be nice to say hi. Basically, my life, as with many of us, has been made a lot easier by this great framework for MacAdmins called AutoPkg that allows us to, in an automated way and in a reliable and repeatable way, package software that would otherwise be a little bit difficult to package and deploy it easily to our fleets of computers that we manage. And there's a lot out there about AutoPkg. There's a great wiki. There's lots of blog posts about using AutoPkg. There isn't as much about how to use AutoPkg securely and safely. And so I wanted to kind of start a conversation about that. I put down some ideas, not only about how not to do bad things, but also, of course, to get to there, we have to show you what bad things are possible. So we're going to take off our white hats and put on our black hats for a minute and have some fun. But of course, I expect the knowledge to be used only for good, never for evil. And you know, it's all in fun, but in the end, I'll give you the antidote and show you how to do things right, how to do things securely, because AutoPkg is a great tool. So this is important because there are more and more people in the AutoPkg ecosystem, and there are more and more organizations as a result that are using AutoPkg, and therefore there's more and more Macs every year that are installing software that went through the AutoPkg pipe in some way. So it's really on us as admins to be responsible for making sure that pipeline is secure, because the more Macs are affected by that, the larger a target it is. And it wouldn't be difficult for somebody to exploit some of these ideas that I'm presenting. So us knowing about them and preventing them is ever more important as AutoPkg gets more popular. And many people aren't even familiar with some of the security features and conventions that we as admins have kind of put around AutoPkg and best practices and how to use them. So I want to make sure to spread that knowledge and make sure everybody's aware of some of those things. But first, let me cover two real quick computing concepts. The first is probably familiar to anybody who's spent time around computers for more than a day. Garbage in, garbage out. The idea is computers do what you tell them, and if you tell them to do something good, then you'll get good output. If you tell them to do something bad, you might get bad output. So AutoPkg is no different. It's just it's a computer, essentially. It follows a series of instructions. It does what you tell it to do. If you do something bad, you get something bad out. So AutoPkg takes recipes, processors, and input variables as its inputs, and it goes through and does its processing and turns recipes and all those inputs into software, into packages, installers, and other metadata that can be used to distribute those installers. If you provide a bad recipe, it will happily take that and follow the instructions and potentially provide you with a bad package that you could potentially install on your fleet. You wouldn't want to do that. So that's a pretty basic concept that really touches on a lot of the things we're going to talk about today. The next is what I call the software supply chain. Basically, this is the points along the path from where software is created to where it's used. And you could call it whatever you want, but basically it's like a retail supply chain. There's somebody responsible for creating the thing, for shipping the thing, for selling the thing, and then eventually somebody uses the thing. Same thing with software. And there are many points in this supply chain in the AutoPkg world. That include the developer's web host, AutoPkg processors and recipes, GitHub itself, where most of these recipes are stored, your network, your local company network, your local computer that runs AutoPkg, and eventually the endpoints. Now that endpoints dot should really be bigger than the whole rest of the chart, because potentially there's thousands or tens of thousands of endpoints that you're deploying to, and that's a very big deal if something reaches the endpoint and compromises them. Much bigger deal than compromising your own Mac, for example. So I'm going to demonstrate potential points of vulnerability of each of these points on the supply chain, and we'll recall back to this as we talk. So the first thing I thought about when I was folding my tinfoil hats late at night was path deleter. Path deleter is a core processor in AutoPkg that allows you to delete things. It does what it says on the box. And if you give it input that tells it to delete something useful, which is what it's usually used for, it'll delete that thing. This is, for example, deleting a folder called applications in our recipe cache folder. Maybe we're cleaning up after a particularly big package is expanded, or maybe we're just getting rid of some cruft before we create a disk image. AutoPkg can delete stuff that you don't need before you proceed to the next step, which is often very useful. But garbage in, garbage out, it can be directed to delete whatever you want. Whatever you have access to delete, AutoPkg can delete. And by you, I really mean the user that you're running AutoPkg in the context of. That's usually the user you're logged in as if you run AutoPkg run, or if you launch AutoPkgr, one of those things. It's whatever user you're logged in as. So whatever permissions that user has to delete, AutoPkg can do those things if directed properly. So, for example, we could do something really trivial. We could create a package with package creator, and then we could immediately use path deleter to delete that same package. The package underscore path variable is the output of package creator. This is completely pointless and not useful at all, but we could do it. Path deleter does that kind of thing. Something that would be a little bit scarier would be this, deleting your recipe overrides, for example. Hopefully you have these backed up somewhere. Maybe it's not the end of the world. You could always make the overrides again, set the input variables. Ideally, you're running AutoPkg on a VM, and you can just revert back to the snapshot. So it's not the end of the world, but still, it's one step up in the supply chain, causing us some headaches. But here's something really bad. If you're running AutoPkg and connecting it to monkey recipes, you probably have write access to a monkey repo. And path deleter can happily delete that repo. Anything that you have access to in that repo could vanish. And you don't even need to be root to do this in many cases. If you have it mounted as a file system, then it depends on the permissions allowed in the file system. So we're not even talking about privilege escalation here. The user you're already logged in as could potentially cause problems with the monkey repo. So that looks like this, because why not? It's entertaining, right? Boom, gone. But it's not just path deleter we have to worry about. It's not just deleting things that could be a potential bad thing. Overwriting things can cause some of the same problems. And you might not think of copier as a lossy processor, but copier does have an input variable called overwrite. And if overwrite is set to anything other than false, essentially, you could set it to true, you could set it to foo. Anything that Python considers truthy is going to cause copier to overwrite the path that you're copying to. And that's usually very useful in some cases, but could be bad. So this is a bad situation here. We've got copier with the destination of monkey repo, and overwrite is set to true. Now, somebody who's not familiar with AutoPkg or with monkey might look at this and say, okay, that makes sense. We're copying a new app to our monkey repo, and we want to overwrite the old version, right? No, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. That looks like this. So we've replaced our monkey repo with the applications folder that we copied in. I think that was the cake brew recipe that did that. So inside the applications folder is cakebrew.app. But that's not how you import something in your monkey repo. That's very damaging. It's just as bad as deleting the entire repo for all intents and purposes. And it's not just copier that can do this. Many different processors. These core processors all have the ability to overwrite their destination file. So if you overwrite the right file or folder, you could potentially delete useful data. And some of them delete files, some can even delete folders, but these are all built into AutoPkg and able to overwrite. But we don't have to stick with the processors that are built in. With AutoPkg, because it's all based in Python and very modular, we can build our own processors, put them next to our recipes and call them as needed. And that allows us to execute basically arbitrary code. And this is a processor that I wrote that I fortunately do not use, called delete app folder. And it does what it says. It deletes your applications folder. First, it strips the protective ACLs from the applications folder, and then it does sudo rm-rf. Now, when that runs, or when it's called by a recipe, it looks like this. Now, let's pause here for just a minute. Notice that when I ran my recipe, I didn't use sudo as a prefix. I'm just using regular AutoPkg run, like I should, but it's asking me for my password. That's a red flag. If any AutoPkg execution asks you for your admin password, something's probably gone wrong, and you should stop and look at the processors, look at the recipes, figure out what's happening, because AutoPkg really isn't very interactive most of the time. Maybe it'll ask you if it can't find a recipe if you want to search on GitHub. Maybe if you're using Monkey import or something like that, you could, there's some potential interactivity there. But most of the time, AutoPkg will, well, all of the time, it will never ask you for your administrative credentials. So this is a problem. But let's say I don't know any better, and I'm just going to put in my password. Oops. Probably should have backed all those up. Yeah, this VM got destroyed a lot. So you get the idea. And you can say whatever output you want, you can put in the processor. Unicorns and rainbows, only nice things happening. It doesn't matter. What really matters is the code that the processor is executing. And that's what's deleting all the stuff here. And the same thing goes for pre-install and post-install scripts. Any opportunity for AutoPkg to run arbitrary code or for it to pass arbitrary code into the downstream systems like Monkey or Jamf is potentially a threat. Normally, custom processors, you'll see many custom processors parse particularly tricky version numbers in apps. Like I have a GoToMeeting recipe, and the GoToMeeting version number is kind of a complex thing. So I use a custom processor to parse that. There's a lot of URL providers. There's like a Mozilla URL provider that we're going to talk about in a minute. So custom processors are a thing, and they're a useful thing, but you just have to make sure you understand what they're doing before you run recipes that require them. And we'll talk about pre-install and post-install scripts later. That's a whole bigger deal. But let's talk about the order in which AutoPkg does things, or searches for things, rather. If you look in your AutoPkg preferences, the com.github.autopkg.plist file in your preferences folder, you'll see recipe search directories. This is the ordered list of directories that AutoPkg looks for recipes and processors in. And it starts with the dot, that's your current working directory. That allows you to cd into a particular path and run a recipe directly right from there. But then all the ones beyond that are your built-in search path. And typically those are the repositories that you've cloned from GitHub that contain the recipes that you care about. And that's a good thing. But know that the order of that matters. If I create a new recipe repo called foobar, and you see it up at the top there in yellow, and it contains a firefox.monkey recipe with the same identifier as the actual firefox.monkey recipe in the official recipe repo, AutoPkg is going to run my fake Firefox recipe, not the real one, because it's earlier in the search path. And I not only stole the file name, I stole the identifier. So if we do AutoPkg info and get info on the actual identifier of the Firefox monkey recipe, it's going to show you the info on my fake recipe instead. And my fake recipe has a crucial flaw. Code signature verification is disabled. And we'll get to what that is in a few minutes. But basically, it doesn't verify the thing that it's downloading. It's not making sure that Firefox is actually what it retrieves. So you could be pointing to some random URL, downloading some random app, and it's going to call that Firefox. It's not going to double check that. It could be MacKeeper, it could be Genio, whatever. So that you open yourself up to bad things when code signature verification is turned off. And you might think, well, I'm running an override of my Firefox monkey recipe, so I'm safe, right? I'm protected. Well, that's not necessarily true. If any recipe higher up in the chain is hijacked, then all the recipes that depend on that recipe are also hijacked. And so if you're running a Firefox monkey recipe override, and I hijack the actual Firefox monkey recipe, that means I've also hijacked your override. And that's bad. Similarly, processors are also reliant on that same search path. So if I have a custom Firefox or Mozilla URL provider recipe, which is used by the Firefox download recipe to determine where to download Firefox, if I hijack that, then I've suddenly gained the ability to run arbitrary code in Python format. I can put whatever I want in that Python file because it's going to get called by the Firefox download recipe. So that's pretty fun, right? Next is surprise variables. You can actually do kind of variable injection with AutoPkg using the -k switch. AutoPkg run -k will allow you to specify an input variable that you want to override at runtime. And that's even if you're running a recipe override and are overriding those variables in the recipe override, this still takes priority. So if you do -k GitHub repo, for example, it will override the GitHub repo that is being specified in the recipe override. And so in this case, I started out with AD-passmon, which is a great utility, and I'm running the AD-passmon download recipe. But along the way, I'm injecting so many different variables that by the end, I actually end up with the MacAdmin app. I'm turning off code signature verification, I'm specifying a different GitHub repo, and I get a totally different app. And the recipe doesn't error out. It goes all the way through and gives me MacAdmin, another great app. But that's not the one I asked for. So if you're running a script that calls all your recipes, you want to make sure that you have access to that script and that you lock that down. Because if people start adding input variables to that script, bad things could potentially happen. Now, normally you would avoid this by running a recipe list instead of calling the recipe by name in the run command. But you know, it's possible, especially during troubleshooting, that you're typing AutoPkg run manually. You just want to make sure that you're not adding too many variables to lose control of which one is actually being downloaded. Along the same lines as custom processors that we talked about earlier, many recipes also specify pre-install and post-install scripts as part of their packaging routine. And these scripts are potentially even more dangerous than the arbitrary code that can be run in Python and Shell at AutoPkg runtime, because they have the opportunity to run as root on the actual endpoints. Post-install scripts and pre-install scripts in packages always run as root, so they have permission to do pretty much whatever they want. So anytime you see a pre-install script or a post-install script as part of a recipe, definitely pay attention to that. Maybe run it in a VM just to make sure it doesn't cause any damage. Try to understand what's going on before you deploy that to the fleet. This one I had a little fun with. This is actually a monkey uninstaller. So whatever monkey is installing as part of the package info for this app, after it's done installing the app, it uninstalls monkey. And if you don't have any other agents installed on that computer, it's now off the grid. And you've got to walk desk to desk and get those computers back enrolled in monkey. It's not a good way to spend a weekend. And similarly, we don't want to leave our Jamf friends behind. So I've made a JSS importer processor here that includes a script called going dark. I wonder what that could do. That we then scope in a policy to all computers, set it to run at the next check-in, and that's the stuff nightmares are made of. If we want to, we could even have going dark check for Casper check and remove your backup plan as well. Casper check is a great utility by Rich Troughton that backs up Casper by making sure that you can actually run a policy. And if you can't, it downloads and runs a quick add to get you re-enrolled. It's a great tool, but it uses launch daemons and scripts just like many other great tools, and therefore can be detected by other scripts and removed. So you want to, not get in that situation. You're thinking, that's not going to happen to me. I'm smart. Yes, all of you are very smart. I'm very smart. The whole AutoPkg community has demonstrated impressive intelligence thus far. And it's really not about intelligence. It's about trust. At this point, everybody involved in AutoPkg is trying to do the right thing. It's a relatively small community. And I think at last check, I looked, and there were 92 repos in the AutoPkg organization. And many of those people I actually know personally, and I can vouch for them, and I know that they're competent and smart. But let's be honest, the bar for getting a repo in the AutoPkg organization is not particularly high. You write a couple of recipes and you put up a repo on GitHub, you ask to be forked, and there you have it. So really, anybody could potentially appear in the AutoPkg repo organization. And as soon as they have a repo in that organization, their recipes start showing up in search results. And many admins who are searching for recipes find what they're looking for and stop, rather than actually reading the recipe and making sure it does what they want it to do. And that's a point of danger. If you're not reading the recipe and you just run the latest thing that you found, you're running arbitrary code, essentially. So you want to be careful of that. It's impossible to personally know everybody, but of course, it helps, and it helps to be able to read the code too and make sure you know what people are doing. And if people prove themselves over a long period of time, then maybe you can, trust them a little bit more. But not necessarily, because it's not just about who you trust and how smart they are. It's also about how secure their own practices are. I don't know for sure that everybody in the AutoPkg repo organization uses two-factor on their GitHub account, or uses two-factor on their email, or has a good Mac password, or even any Mac password. If their computer gets owned, then their AutoPkg repo gets owned, and then I get owned. So that's, basically there has to be some embedded level of trust that goes above and beyond just knowing somebody or trusting them personally, or even reading their code once and trusting it. Because I, as a good actor, could decide later that I don't care about this recipe anymore, I'm going to nuke it. And unless you read each change that I make, you could potentially be subject to that. So basically, it's nothing personal. We just want to verify everything that happens in our AutoPkg world. And the one thing that allows bad changes to sneak into our environments, more than anything, is this checkbox. And I can be a little harsh on this checkbox because I'm the one that put the checkbox there. This is AutoPkg, for those of you who don't use it already. In the Schedule tab, there's a checkbox that allows you to update your recipe repos before each run. And that happens automatically. There's no prompting or anything like that. At the time, it seemed like a very convenient thing to add. It still is very convenient in certain circumstances. But I would argue that most of us should have this box unchecked, because that's the way we pay attention to changes. That's the way that we make sure that all the code that we're running is what we want to run. And checking this box opens up a nice wide door for mistakes, mischief, and malice to walk through. And so definitely uncheck this box. The only situation I would say you should check this box is if you own and control all of the repositories you're subscribed to. If you have your own forks of all the repos and you're controlling what goes into them, then sure, that makes sense. You can check this box. If you don't meet that criteria, just go in and do yourself a favor right now and uncheck that one. I'll show you how my way for checking for changes a little bit later that will mitigate the babysitting that you have to do to make sure the changes are good. Well, we'll get to that. Sometimes it's not about malice or about incompetence or anything. It's just about typos. I've made typos myself. I had a hard time thinking of how a particular typo might ruin your whole fleet. I guess maybe a typo in a post-install script that runs as root, maybe an RM command that doesn't have a space escaped properly or something like that. That happens, and you want to catch those things before they get to too many computers. But even something as simple as this, notice that the string tag is not closed, and that's not proper XML, and therefore not proper plist format. And in many cases, I've had something as simple as this prevent me from running any AutoPkg recipes at all. And it's really difficult to troubleshoot because you get an error, but the recipe that you get an error about is not the recipe that's preventing things from running. So I ended up having to do a whole recursive PL util lint on my whole recipe folder to figure out which one was not proper syntax. Turned out it wasn't even in my recipe folder. It was in my current working directory because I was doing some stuff that was still in progress and hadn't finished the file yet. So yeah, it's typos can prevent you from doing work at best, or potentially delete things that aren't supposed to be deleted at worst. Technical confusion is another bad thing that can happen. People who are just getting into Monkey sometimes don't know the difference between manifests and catalogs. Small sidebar, because I find it helpful. I really like the restaurant analogy. The catalog is the menu. And the restaurant can have multiple menus, one for dinner, one for lunch, one for brunch on the weekends, for example. The manifest is what you order from that menu. That really helps me understand the difference between catalogs and manifests. So in this situation here, we've got this is a Monkey admin. We've got a manifest called developers that probably has a bunch of coding things in it, but it's also subscribed to, it's part of the development catalog. That's probably a mistake. The development catalog usually means it's stuff that you just downloaded and haven't quite tested yet. You're still working on developing that package before you distribute it to your fleet. But somebody who's not familiar with that, admittedly very confusing nomenclature, might think, oh yeah, the developers should have access to the development catalog, right? Not necessarily. They're two different concepts, and the Monkey administrator should know the difference between those things. If you find something like that in an AutoPkg recipe, it's really easy to inherit somebody else's practices that don't necessarily fit your own organization. So for example, the Monkey Tools AutoPkg recipes are super useful, but they do import into a catalog called development. And I don't have that catalog, and I don't want that catalog. So I change mine to testing. And that makes it really clear that, yes, this new version of Monkey Tools is still in testing. It's not for the developers. It's still in testing in IT before it goes out to the fleet. Likewise, technical confusion can arise from the fact that there are more than one recipe with the same name. And even if they have a different name, they might do similar things with similar apps. So Firefox.jss, for example, there's at least two recipes that I know of that are Firefox.jss. One of them has, I think it has a pre-install script that removes Firefox from the applications folder before it installs the new version. And unless you read the recipe, you don't know the difference between those things. And you really do have to know what they're doing in order to know which one is best for your particular company. And along the same lines, technical confusion kind of escalates exponentially as you integrate more systems. So anything having to do with AutoPkg, AutoPkgr, JSS importer, and your Jamf server really gets up there in terms of moving parts that you have to keep track of. It's, I've been scripting this kind of automation for years, and even I sometimes have to go back to the manual and figure out, like, what's this API call again, or what's JSS importer trying to do? So you'd be forgiven for not being able to keep track of every single moving part here. But if you're administrating a system that uses these parts, it is, it's kind of your job to do that. So there's people out there to help, including myself, but it does get confusing sometimes. Here's a mistake that I made personally, and I'll own up to it. I've got a lot of recipes that I administer, and one of them was Cake Brew that I created. It's a great GUI app that lets you manage your homebrew instance on your local computer. And one of my clients asked for Cake Brew to be installed on their computer, so I made a recipe for this. Unfortunately, I didn't pay quite close enough attention, and Cake Brew actually is not with a capital B, as I initially spelled it. It's with a lowercase b. So later I discovered that mistake, and I went back and I did a find and replace Cake Brew with a capital B with Cake Brew with a lowercase b, just in the Cake Brew folder, of course. And unfortunately, I also changed the identifier of the recipe. And I learned that recipe identifiers are, in fact, case sensitive. And what that did is it essentially broke all the recipes that people were using to package Cake Brew. unless they discovered, oh, there's a change in this recipe. Looks like they changed the identifier and created a new override or changed their existing override to match the parent recipe identifier. Unless people did that, their cake brew recipe just stopped working, as did mine. And it went unnoticed for a while. I actually continued deploying myself. I think this was on my home monkey server, because who doesn't have a home monkey server, right? I kept deploying cake brew to myself, but it was an old version. It didn't update because I hadn't yet added the new cake brew with a lowercase b into my manifest. And so this caused me to eventually reach out to the developer of cake brew on Twitter and complain about the lack of a feature that I really wanted. And he replied and said, actually, that's been in cake brew for a while now. And I looked on my computer, compared my version of cake brew, which I assumed to be the latest, to the version that was on their website, and found that I actually didn't have the latest. So that was a little bit of a public fail. I thanked him and said that was my bad and moved on. But yeah, learn from my mistake. If you're going to do bulk finding and replacing, just make sure don't change the identifier unless you really mean to, and watch the context too, because finding and replacing capital B with lowercase b, for example, would have also been bad. That might have messed up a code signature verifier or some other tags or something like that. So just be careful. Another bad thing, loose licensing. Many of you probably remember Flip for Mac. That was a plugin and an app that allowed you to run AVI files in QuickTime, among other things. There was a pro version of the app, and if you used the AutoPkg recipe to deploy Flip for Mac, you actually got the pro version for free. It was very convenient for people who wanted that, very inconvenient for the Flip for Mac developer and for the AutoPkg recipe author. So that version of the recipe was eventually pulled and corrected. But it's possible, based on little quirks that apps use for licensing, that this kind of thing might happen again. So you just want to be aware of, kind of keep your ear to the community and see, make sure that recipes aren't doing the wrong thing accidentally. Sometimes that happens. Likewise, you could potentially own 2 copies of Final Cut Pro and relatively easily package those up with AutoPkg, deploy them to your fleet of 20 computers, and you would be technically out of compliance with App Store requirements. Not a great idea. So make sure you back all your purchases with VPP. AutoPkg might not be the best way to deploy those things, but if you do use AutoPkg, just make sure you buy enough copies to cover who you're installing on, because it's easy not to do that, really. Speaking of editing software, not every update is a great update for many people. If anybody was particularly attached to the timeline editor in iMovie HD, for example, you probably weren't so happy when iMovie 09 came out and got rid of that editor. And then subsequent versions of iMovie simplified even further. And if you have video editors who depend on timeline features and are for some reason still using iMovie, you wouldn't want to push that update out. You would want to check with them and kind of find a compromise before you just replace their copy of iMovie with the new one. And a staging and testing workflow can help with that. Similarly, new version of the browser comes out, and its encryption requirements are a little bit more stringent than the last version. You have an internal web app that doesn't meet those encryption requirements. If you blindly push this new version of the browser out to everybody in your fleet, suddenly you've broken access to that web app, and now you've got a lot of help desk tickets that you have to close. So that's why you would want a staging and testing workflow. Test on yourself first. Think of all the things you could do with that new version of the browser and just kick the tires a little bit. Then reach out to somebody who really depends on that browser and have them install it. See if they can still use all the things they require. Don't just push things out blindly. Side loading and hijacking. This is straight from the headlines. January 2009, a small bug in the Sparkle updater framework that many apps use to keep themselves up to date was discovered. And it was determined that a man-in-the-middle attack could be used to hijack an app's updating system and cause them to install a different app or run arbitrary code. So that's a bad thing. That wasn't necessarily related to AutoPkg, but if you're using AutoPkg to package and distribute apps that have Sparkle built in, you were vulnerable. You were making your fleet vulnerable. So people scrambled around to find profiles and distribute them that shut down the Sparkle updater for specific apps. And Alistair Banks has a great tool called Extinguish that lets you do that really easily in bulk. But it really affected people who were using AutoPkg because we used a lot of these apps and deployed them. But sometimes the threat is the developer itself. In this case, Oracle started bundling the Ask toolbar, which nobody ever asks for, with Java. And I don't think the AutoPkg recipes were directly affected by this, or if they were, it was for such a short period of time so as not to really matter. But it's a significant risk. You know, if a developer changes something about their app that is either not helpful or malicious, you don't want to automatically push that app out to your systems. It might not be the developer, too. It might be the developer's web host. In this case, SourceForge got in trouble for packaging the GIMP image manipulation program with adware. And if you downloaded GIMP from SourceForge, it would include some stuff that you probably didn't ask for. And Mac Update also found itself in the same situation. I think there's a tweet there that says somebody downloaded the Skype app, and it came prepackaged in a Skype installer that installed a bunch of other stuff in addition to Skype. So always, if you're writing AutoPkg recipes, always go to the primary source if you can. Go to the developer to download stuff. Don't rely on SourceForge or Mac Update or download.com, heaven forbid. Get it right from the developer if you can. And if the only place they host it is on SourceForge, then you do what you can. Sometimes I reach out to developers and say, hey, are you ever going to go to GitHub? And some of them do, but many of them are still on SourceForge. But try to avoid third-party intermediaries if you can. Next, administrative fatigue. We've all seen dialog box madness like this, or email madness. These are notifications from AutoPkg about new things being downloaded or new packages being built or imported. And it's really easy, especially if you leave the default settings, to have kind of an overload of these notifications. So the key is to go into AutoPkg and turn off the ones you don't want. But really, you want it to be the signal-to-noise ratio to be high. You want, if something truly bad happens, you want to see that error, and you don't want to ignore that email. But at the same time, you don't want to receive a bunch of stuff that are false positives, that are like, I downloaded this new version. It's actually 2 new versions of the same app, and it's the same version. I don't know why I'm telling you twice. Yeah, that happens sometimes. And unless you understand why it's happening and how to turn it off, it can potentially cause you to ignore valid errors. And last but not least, over-automation. This is something that I've been guilty of in the past. I had a client who, for great valid reasons, asked me to create a Flash recipe for their JSS that would deploy Flash directly to their production fleet as soon as it came out. And they wanted to stay up to date as quick as possible, have everybody patched within 48 hours or something like that. But in reality, I got lucky. Nothing bad ever happened from this, but it could have very easily. And so having somebody kick the tires on Flash and certify, yes, this package is good, we're okay to deploy it, only takes probably 10 or 15 minutes, tops. You can fire up a VM, install Flash, open up a site, make sure it doesn't break anything, inspect the package, make sure it just contains Flash, that kind of thing. It doesn't take very long, and it could potentially save you from a slip in a software developer's QA process. So that's a lot of bad things. That's 15. I'm sure I could think of more if I took my tinfoil hats back out. Anything from just simply deleting things to typos to too many alerts. There's just a lot of things that can happen in the AutoPkg ecosystem. But I'm here to tell you that there is hope. And here's where you get the antidote to the poison. I want to give you a few tips. Don't want to scare you away from using AutoPkg. I just want to show you how to use AutoPkg securely and safely in as convenient a way as possible. As you know, security and convenience are often at odds. We want to slide the dial as much to security as possible, but still get as much convenience as we can do without giving up any security. The first and foremost thing to keep in mind is not to run AutoPkg as root. This one's easy to remember because if you ever forget and actually run AutoPkg as root, you get a very scary warning about running modify and delete important system files. Yes, that's true. It could do that. If you run AutoPkg as root, you're opening yourself up to a lot more problems than in user context. So for example, that applications folder that I deleted earlier could be done without the sudo command in the recipe if you yourself as the administrator put sudo in front of AutoPkg. So don't put sudo in front of AutoPkg. You might encounter other situations where tacking sudo on the beginning actually solves problems. So for example, if you're trying to tail a file or cat a file, sometimes adding sudo is necessary because that file exists in a place that you yourself don't have access to. With AutoPkg, that's almost never true. If you encounter permissions problems, there's probably something deeper going on. Maybe your git install is messed up, or maybe your AutoPkg preferences permissions are wrong, or something like that. It requires deeper troubleshooting. You can't just brute force it. Next, I'm going to plug a tool that I wrote called Recipe Robot. And this is to serve as a teaching tool, kind of, to help you learn to write AutoPkg recipes. Recipe Robot takes as input a URL to download an app, or an app itself, or a Sparkle feed, or a GitHub repo, or any number of other things. And it tries to gather as much information as it can in order to write AutoPkg recipes automatically for that app. So if you have a custom app that you want to use AutoPkg with, and you don't see a recipe for it in the wild, you can very easily create one with Recipe Robot in many cases, not in all cases. But the hidden gem of Recipe Robot is that I actually learned to write AutoPkg recipes better by creating Recipe Robot, because it showed me the patterns between recipes, the commonalities, and the common threads that are between various apps' recipes. There's a lot of patterns that repeat. Recipes are justplists, right? And we as MacAdmins probably already speak that language. Preferences are plists, launch daemons are plists, configuration profiles, if you're using MDM, you're probably writing plists by hand in many cases. So it's not that hard to learn to read and even write recipes because they're plists. They're something we're already familiar with. And I suspect that's why plist was chosen as that format. And if you are going to learn to read and write recipes, just make sure to use a real proper text editor. As with any coding that you do, you don't want to use TextEdit or Word or Pages. You want to use something like Atom, Sublime, BBEdit. Text Wrangler was a great one, but that's kind of going away now. It's being replaced by its bigger cousin, BBEdit. Or if you want, VI, Nano, or Emacs. If you know what any of those things are, you probably already have a favorite. And I'm not going to tell you what mine is. Isolate your AutoPkg Mac. This will greatly limit any problems that could potentially happen. If your Mac is, if you have a spare Mac at your organization, a spare MacBook that somebody doesn't want anymore, or a Mac Mini somewhere that's not running anything, use that as your dedicated AutoPkg machine. And you could even take snapshots of it. If it's a VM, even better. It's got snapshotting built in. That way, if something goes wrong, you can just roll back and try again. And if you don't like the recipe that you just ran, or if the recipe deletes your applications folder, you can just roll back. No big deal. Your machine that you're checking email on and doing other tasks on should not be the machine that runs AutoPkg in most cases. It really limits the damage that can be done when it's a totally different machine or a VM. And even worse is to combine mission-critical services together on the same machine. I've done this before for expediency and for budget reasons, but it's not a good idea. And I am completely away from this practice now. The Mac that runs, if you have a monkey repo being served up by a Mac Mini somewhere, don't run AutoPkg on that Mac Mini. There's just too much stuff that could go wrong. Use a VM, use a different Mac if you can, but just keep everything isolated and fenced off from each other, and that will kind of control the explosion if something happens. Next is verifying code signatures. This applies both to people who are running AutoPkg recipes and people who are writing them. People who are writing them should always use code signature verification whenever possible. If the app supports it, you should put in a code signature verifier processor. And it's really easy to do. I'm even going to show you a little automator service that I wrote that you can grab and use if you're writing recipes. It's very useful. If you're running AutoPkg recipes, don't ignore code signature verification errors. What they mean is that this app is not signed the way I expect it to be signed. And that could be very innocent. It could be because your recipe is out of date and there's now a new code signature that needs to be updated. It could be the developer just can't decide which signature to use because they've got a couple different certificates and they flip back and forth between them. We've seen even large companies do that. Or it could be that the app was actually hijacked. You know, if something like Handbrake recently was hijacked by their download server, was compromised, and hackers actually put a compromised version of Handbrake on their server. Handbrake does not use code signing because it's a small organization and they need to collaborate and it's kind of a weird business thing. But if they had been signed, AutoPkg administrators would not have been affected by that at all because the code signature would not have matched the known good signature that was in the recipe. So that can really prevent a lot of problems from the start. And if code signature errors happen, you just want to give them a quick look and make sure that they're good. Don't turn off code signature verification, even though there is an option to do that. Just make sure that what's happening is what's supposed to happen. And if it's not, if the signature is actually bad, reach out to the developer. Many developers are very gracious and thankful about feedback from the community. And some of them even hang out on Slack. So it's something I've had success with. You don't want to end up with firefox.app. And here, I'll keep this slide up for just a minute so you can get that URL if you want. This is an automator workflow that allows you to right-click on an app and choose from the services menu, copy code signature requirements. And if you're writing AutoPkg recipes, you can right-click on that app and copy those requirements and then paste them right into the arguments of code signature verifier. Note also that if you're using Recipe Robot to create recipes, Recipe Robot does this automatically. It grabs the app's code signing requirements and puts it in the recipe automatically, so you don't have to worry about that. Sometimes I actually find a recipe out in the wild and I run Recipe Robot against that same app and compare the two recipes and see what's different. And every once in a while I'll find an app that supports code signing, but the AutoPkg recipe author hasn't built that in yet, maybe because the recipe predates that processor's existence. But I often open pull requests then to make that change. So Recipe Robot's useful for that too. Next, run overrides. This used to say try to run overrides or run overrides liberally or something like that. Now it just says run overrides because AutoPkg 1.0 almost makes it a requirement. And I'll get to why. The reason why is trust info, and I'll show you that on my next slide. But the other benefit of running overrides is that you can customize things directly for your organization. And even if you don't customize anything at all in the recipe, it's a good idea to create an override for it because then you've locked down those variables. And if something changes upstream, you're not necessarily going to have to get that change yourself. You can review and approve that change, and if you like it, you can make it in your override, but you're not subject to somebody else making a change and you inherit it. So always, the recipes that you always run regularly should all be overrides. The only situation that I could think of that you wouldn't want to run an override is if you're doing some troubleshooting. If you're encountering an error in a recipe and you want to directly run all the parent recipes in that chain, that makes sense. And I do see the reason for that. But if you're running in a recipe list on a regular basis, you want all those recipes to be overrides. And overrides, the other reason to use overrides is because they automatically include trust info. Trust info was released in AutoPkg 1.0, and it's one of my favorite recent additions to AutoPkg. Basically what it does is it takes all of the files that go into running an override, all the recipes, the parent recipes, all the processors, and it captures a hash of each of those files. It's like a snapshot in time. Here's what the file looked like at this point. And it embeds that into your recipe override itself. And as long as those files match those hashes, your recipe override continues running just fine. But if any of those files change, any parent recipe or any processor that goes into running your recipe changes, then you get an alert. And as an administrator, it's now your job to go back in there and say, I see these changes, I'm reviewing the changes, I approve of the changes, update the trust information with the new hashes, and now we're good to go until another change happens. It's a great feature and allows you to kind of lock your system down into a known good state and then review before entering a new known good state. It's a good practice. And the way that you administer trust info is actually pretty simple. For such a complicated thing, they've tried to make it as simple as possible. When you make an override with AutoPkg 1.0 or higher, trust information is already embedded into your override. If you have a recipe override that existed before 1.0 and you need to add trust information to it, you can do AutoPkg update trust info. The update trust info verb will add trust information into recipes or update the trust information in recipes that don't already have it or where it's out of date. And if you're doing troubleshooting, if you're trying to figure out why trust errors are happening, you can use the verify trust info verb to verify that everything is okay in that trust. There's a great MacAdmins podcast by Tom Bridge and Pepine and some other folks. It's a great podcast. I recommend everybody subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Tom's around. He's got stickers. They're really cool stickers. But there was an episode of this podcast recently that had Greg Nagel on, and he talked specifically about this new trust feature in AutoPkg. And it's worth a listen if you're using AutoPkg overrides and you want to avoid those trust errors. Take a listen to that. And of course, these are all going to be downloadable in PDF, so you don't have to write down that URL. But you can also Google for MacAdmins episode 15. What trust information allows you to do more easily is to pay attention when things change. It kind of forces you to pay attention when things change. And it used to be that when you did repo updates, you would see something like this, which shows you which files are updating and kind of gives you a general overview of how much stuff in the files are changing. But it doesn't actually tell you which changes are happening and whether they're good or bad. There's kind of a quantitative indicator, but not a qualitative indicator here. And so I'm telling you to pay attention to changes, not in this way, but in a very granular, line-by-line kind of way. And some of you might be thinking, I thought the point of all this automation was so that I don't have to babysit my computers, so that I can go sip Mai Tais on the beach instead of packaging things and paying attention to things. And I get that. I share that concern. But consider that once you start paying attention to changes in AutoPkg recipes, you're kind of babysitting your computer systems at a higher level and a more automated level. And I would argue a more interesting level. And it's, I mean, not to get too much into the soft skills here, but it really is a thing for you to automate yourself into a better career. If you start managing the thing that does the managing or automating the systems that do the automation, that's more fun, right? And then you kind of grow as an admin. I'll speak for myself. That's what happened to me in the last few years as I started getting into AutoPkg. I started discovering that this stuff is fun and this is where I want my career to go. So that's reason enough. But also I would say the point of automation is not to eliminate time spent completely, but rather to maximize the efficiency and minimize the errors when you're automating things. And what this means in AutoPkg world is you want something to be repeatable, reproducible, reliable, and easy to document. If you can document that you've made a change in this recipe, ideally with something like Git, it does it automatically for you. You can go back and review all the changes that have happened, and you can justify why you approved each change. It's much easier that way. So let me show you how I put this into practice and pay attention to changes in AutoPkg recipes. I'm going to throw that terminal command up there because it's a little complicated, but I'm not going to get to that for another minute. First, I will go into AutoPkg, click on the Schedule tab, and uncheck the box that says Update all repos before each run. That's not just a good idea, it's essential to what we're about to do because of trust information. Next, I'll go into the Recipes, or the Repos and Recipes tab, and I'll find a repository that requires an update that's out of date. And you can tell because the indicator on the right is yellow. It means that the version you've got on your disk is behind the version on GitHub. Right-click on that repo and choose Copy Path to Clipboard. And then I go to Terminal and I run this command. What it does is it changes my working directory to the path that I just copied. It does a git fetch to get all the latest changes from the server, from GitHub. But it doesn't apply the changes. In other words, it doesn't move the head. And then it does a diff between the head, where your computer is now, and the origin, the changes that you just downloaded. And it shows you the difference between those two. You could use diff tool. If you wanted to just view the changes in terminal, you could use git diff head origin. I prefer to use a tool called Kaleidoscope. Makes looking at changes super easy. So I've set that up as my git tool, my diff tool, and I do git diff tool head origin. And so that's what that looks like, and this is what you get. So in this case, I'm doing a diff on Alan's recipe repo. Looks like there was an update to the lockdown browser recipe that just happened. And I was actually paying attention in Slack when this was going on. There was some discussion about the lockdown browser and the changes that needed to be made to the recipes. So I kind of knew this was coming. But now I'm looking at the changes firsthand. I'm saying, OK, there's now an institution ID variable. So I'm going to have to find out what my institution ID is and fill that in. There's a base URL, and then there's a search URL. OK, this all makes sense. I kind of know what they're doing. I heard Alan talk about it. So I'm going to go ahead and apply these changes. And the way that I do that is go back to AutoPkg, the Repos and Recipes tab, right-click on that repo, and choose Update this repo only. Then all the changes that I just saw in Kaleidoscope are now applied and live in my repo. And what I need to do after that is update my trust information for that recipe. So I do AutoPkg update trust info, lockdownbrowser.monkey. That's my override that I use for lockdown browser. And it writes a new version of that recipe override with new hashes in the trust information that correspond to the changed recipes that it depends on. And then you repeat that process for other repos that need updating. And I'll go back one slide here. I don't have that many repos, so really this doesn't happen that often for me. I maybe check my recipe repos once a week because there's only really 4 repos that I rely on a regular basis. And that's a good thing. You don't want to add a bunch of repos to your AutoPkg or AutoPkgr that you don't need, because then you're kind of handcuffing yourself to reviewing all those changes for apps and recipes that you don't even deploy. So I would recommend, instead of adding all the repos and then filtering for the recipes you want, just search for recipes that you want using the AutoPkg search feature or using AutoPkgr to search for them, and then add the repo that contains the recipe you need, and that's it. Maybe if you need to, you need to add like 2 repos because one of them depends on the other one. There's like a parent-recipe relationship. But try not to add more repos than you need. Otherwise, you end up doing this every day, and you're always behind. And I grant that it takes more than a minute to do this, so you don't want to do it more than you need to. And there's probably other ways that people have devised to review the changes more quickly. Some people maintain their own forks of AutoPkg recipes, and when things change, sometimes they don't even apply the changes, like it just doesn't apply to them. And that's fine, whatever system works for you. But do make sure to update the trust info after you do the repo update. Otherwise, your overrides won't run. If you want to pay attention to changes, the biggest single thing you can do is put everything in Git. And there's an excellent talk tomorrow. Is it tomorrow? Yes, tomorrow, Thursday. Nick MacAdmins is going to talk about using Git for literally everything. And that's at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So I recommend checking that out if you're interested in that kind of thing. That not only applies to AutoPkg recipe repos, which are probably already in Git, but also your monkey repo. You could, if you haven't already thought of that, you can put your monkey repo in Git. There's lots of blog articles and talks out there about how to do that well. And even if you have like a recipe runner script that you use instead of something like AutoPkgr to periodically run your AutoPkg recipes, that should be in Git version control as well. And that makes it really easy to review all the changes to things. Next, mass edit with caution. You already know why. Learn from my mistakes. If you're going to make big changes to things, just make sure to consider the context and don't change identifiers if you don't need to. If you're not writing recipes, then you probably don't need to worry so much about this, but just be aware when making changes. Next, this is absolutely crucial. If you're a MacAdmin, I would argue that suspicious package is a requirement. You've got to have this installed on your computer. This is both a quick look plugin and an app that allows you to very quickly glance inside package files. And this is something that has been kind of developing for years, and it's really gotten to a point now where it's super reliable and very well designed as well. So I recommend, if you don't have suspicious package, go ahead and download it now. The Wi-Fi seems stable, so just go ahead, I'll wait. But what you get with suspicious package is something like this. You just click on the firefox.pkg and you hit the space bar, and you'll see what's inside the Firefox package. And in this case, we see that it installs firefox.app version 5401, and it doesn't have any pre-install or post-install scripts or any funny business like that. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that it contains an actual working version of Firefox. We would still need to install it on a VM, launch it, make sure it works, make sure there's nothing funny inside the app bundle or something like that. But for just a basic overview that, yes, this is the app that I want, suspicious package is a really great way to see that. But you definitely want to inspect packages before you deploy them, so you don't end up deploying post-install scripts that are either not applicable to your environment or, at worst, like malicious. You don't want to uninstall Monkey after you install Firefox. And for similar reasons, I don't recommend deploying directly to production. You've probably heard people lecture about this before, but ideally you would want some kind of a staging workflow. Test on your computer first, then test in small batches, maybe on a couple people that require the app that you're about to update. Reach out to them and say, hey, is this update okay? And then you can deploy it more widely. And ideally, you would use something like self-service or managed software center, if you're using Monkey, to do the actual testing, because that very closely mimics how the app is going to be deployed in real life. Versus them going to mozilla.org and downloading Firefox themselves. Help them out. Put it in self-service or put it in managed software center. And that way you're halfway there when you want to deploy that to the fleet. You just have to make a few changes to the package info or to the policy, rather than having to start from scratch. But yeah, the quality assured stamp there kind of indicates you as the administrator are kind of like the meat inspector, right? You're the one who's going to get blamed if people start getting sick. So just make sure that the stuff you deploy is all ready to eat. Okay, that analogy didn't work. Sorry. Scapegoats? Yeah. The guy who just went on vacation is always a good one. Yeah. A next addition to AutoPkg 1.0 that I really enjoyed was the audit verb. And I think Greg Nagel wrote most of the code behind audit. I think he was a lot inspired by Eric Gomez, who's at Pinterest currently. And he basically, there was a whole big discussion in the community about how do we know that the recipes that we're running are safe. We know people that can read recipes and read processors already know because they see the code that's being executed, but not everybody knows Python. Not everybody needs to know Python. So how do you know, what's an easy way to tell whether something is deserving of extra suspicion, let's say? And the audit verb is kind of the answer to that. If you do AutoPkg audit and then the path to a recipe or the name of a recipe, AutoPkg will review that recipe for things that might deserve some additional scrutiny. So for example, here I did an audit on the Adobe Flash Player Monkey recipe. This is the standard one, not the one that I'm hijacking. And it says at the bottom, after giving you some information, it says the following processors are non-core and can execute arbitrary code, performing any action. Be sure you understand what the processor does and or you trust its source. That is a great 10-second version of this whole talk, essentially. And that means that you would want to probably go in and look at the Adobe Flash URL provider and try to follow the chain of commands that it's running. It's written in Python, but there's lots of people out here that can help determine what the code is. It's all available on GitHub, so you can send a link to flash URL provider on Slack and say, hey, what does this line do? I'm concerned that this is not what I want to run. And the answer will more often than not be, oh yeah, that's okay. That's just getting a thing from Adobe's API download site or something like that. But you definitely want to understand what the recipe is doing and what processors it's calling to determine how much of it at risk you are. And audit can easily help with that. There is a great article on scriptingos10.com. I guess when you read it as part of a URL, it's scriptingosx.com. Feels weird. But that is a kind of a great introduction to recipe auditing using the new audit verb. And of course, documentation. This is a great way to prevent bad things from happening, is write it down. If you know something well enough to be able to write it down and explain it to somebody else, then you're on the right track. And not only write it down and have it documented, but also have somebody else read the documentation and make sure that it makes sense. You don't want documentation for an audience of one. You want documentation for your whole team, ideally, or the person who's taking over for you while you're on vacation on the beach sipping Mai Tais, or the person who's replacing you when you're moving on to a new company. It's really important to make sure that you're writing in an understandable way that somebody else can understand. And keeping it up to date is important too. Shay Craig last year introduced me to the idea of documentation jam sessions, where you get the whole team together, you order tacos, you go into a room and you close the door, and you're in there for an hour just jamming out whatever documentation needs updating. Open up your Confluence and go to a random page and say, can I make this page better? Or go through all the pages that you own and say, what about this is now out of date and needs to be updated? Stuff like that. And if tacos are involved, then everybody's going to love it, right? Last and least is the principle of least privilege. You probably know what this is. Even if you don't know it by name, you probably have practiced it for years. But it's giving a user account only those privileges which are essential to that user's work, minimizing the blowback if something bad happens. So for example, you wouldn't want your financial contractor to have full admin access to your Active Directory just because they need an AD account to log into the financial system. That doesn't make any sense. You want to limit the privileges so that if something bad happens, that the damage is also contained. And that applies for when you're setting up JSS API accounts or actual accounts on the JSS, when you're setting up Monkey repo access in Google or Amazon cloud environments, in any kind of system you're setting up in IT, but more specifically, your AutoPkg repos and all the code that runs. The computer that runs AutoPkg, is that in an open room that somebody can walk up to and mess around with and shut down, preventing you from running any recipes at all. You just want to make sure that you consider both logical and physical access to things that are in the AutoPkg pipeline. So now we're to the end, where I tell you what this all means. I hope I haven't scared you away from AutoPkg. I think Greg Nagel in that podcast I linked to actually said it really well. He said AutoPkg, when you think of it, is a really scary thing. It downloads something from the internet, which is already a scary place, does who knows what to it, and then sends it out to all your computers. And that is what could possibly go wrong? And the answer is many things can go wrong, but there's also some simple things you can do to prevent those things from going wrong. And one of the most important things in understanding your tools and understanding how to securely use AutoPkg is the community that we have here in this room. Transparency and collaboration are very powerful security tools. And if you have any questions, the fact that you have at your fingertips real-time answers, in mere seconds, people can answer questions about AutoPkg on the Slack channel. And there's email lists, and there's GitHub issues. There's lots of different venues that you can go through to get the questions answered, and that's a very powerful thing. So I would encourage you, if you're not already on Slack, every single presenter will probably tell you that you should definitely sign up. But yeah, also, if you have any questions for me, definitely reach out. I'll be hanging out here afterwards a little bit, and I'll be in the hallways. Looks like we've got about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to questions. Thank you, everybody. Anybody? anybody have questions? All right. Saw the coffee.
Good call. Is this on?
Yep.
What recommendation would you have for setting up an AutoPkg recipe list run as a non-privileged user at a non-logged in workstation? So if I have a Mac Mini that's sitting at the login window most of the time and I want it to run AutoPkg regularly, how do I get it to do that, not as root?
Right, yeah. AutoPkg does that by default. So obviously a GUI tool is kind of obfuscating the command line in some ways. So if you're using AutoPkg, it's important to know what's happening behind the scenes so that if something happens, you can troubleshoot it. But that is exactly what AutoPkg does by default. If you launch it and set it up, choose the recipes you want to run, make overrides for them, and make sure the overrides are checked in your list, and then set the schedule, and then log out and let that computer run headless, AutoPkg actually installs a launch daemon that runs as the user that you set it up with. So even if you're at the login window, it will still run those AutoPkg commands on the schedule that you chose using the user context that you set. So that's one way to do it. Another way would be to, I guess, a launch agent, but then I guess you have to stay logged in. I've always just used AutoPkg because I was involved with the project and it was easiest at the time. But I know that a lot of people use Jenkins and other systems to automate the whole continuous integration. Wes Whetstone from Square is actually giving a talk about continuous integration, I think with regard to AutoPkg and Monkey, among other things, tomorrow. So I'm not sure what time that is, but that might be a good one to stop by. I hope that helps. Yeah. Yeah.
I understand the objection to pushing things straight to production because I've had that philosophy for decades. But I have clients who have cloud services that will literally refuse to work with them if they don't have the latest Flash that was released 6 hours ago.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you? Anybody got any good answers to that, or is it just a rock and a hard place?
It is a rock and a hard place. It's also making smart exceptions to that rule, which, that's the whole reason I had that code to show you, is because I wrote it for a client who had similar requirements. And sometimes the easiest path to follow, and eventually the most secure path to follow, was to give them what they needed in the moment, and then kind of walk them back to a more secure place as your relationship with them grows. As they trust you more, and as you are able to convince them to use Git for things and to make a staging group for things. I was successful in many cases to convince them, instead of deploying to everybody, we're now going to deploy directly to 10%. And we're going to wait a couple days and see how those 10% are. And if nobody had any blowups, then we'll deploy to everybody else.
I understand what you're saying, but I've witnessed that situations where they would get stuck at 10 o'clock in the morning trying to get their work done. And it wasn't a small group. It could be anybody in the office.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are definitely situations where, based on company demands, not all of which might be reasonable, you just have to do what they're asking for. But hopefully they'll be open to your future feedback and kind of walking them to a more secure place, especially if you consider there are many other companies with massive compliance requirements that are doing things in a better way, that are deploying to staging groups first. A lot of companies are very attracted to the "I want to do what Google does" philosophy, or "I want to do what Facebook does." And I think there are some best practices being demonstrated there that are both compliant and convenient at the same time.
Back to the question about AutoPkg at the login window. How are you overcoming mounting your repo for running Monkey recipes?
Yeah, I think that is part of the Monkey Monkey importer processor, and it doesn't always work. Not even if you're logged in, it doesn't always work. So usually what I do on those situations is I have the computer dedicated to running AutoPkg. I just leave it logged in, I leave the repo mounted, and I just refer to the file path that's already going to be there. But yeah, that's not, it's an art, not a science sometimes. I think we're out of time. All right, cool. Thanks, everybody.